And in terms of the whole date is referred as the Nixon shock. Was it really a shock? I mean, from at least from the perspective of economists and Austrian economists, I suppose the whole Bretton Woods agreement was filled with perhaps some deficiencies, or it was destined to failure. So, was it a shock? Or was just the predictable end road?
I think it was the predictable end to a system that had internal contradictions.
Hmm.
And there were economists who understood this at the time, principally Jacques Rueff, the French economist, and Henry Hazlitt understood pretty well these internal contradictions to the system. And we now teach it to undergraduates using the framework known as the impossible trinity. So a central bank that's trying to fix an exchange rate and also allow free capital flows and money flows cannot control the quantity of money. They have to let money flow in and increase the money supply or flow out to the rest of the world if they're going to maintain the fixed exchange rate, right? They have to become passive with respect to monetary policy. But under Bretton Woods, each country was trying to do all three things: maintain a fixed exchange rate, other countries with the US dollar and the US dollar with gold, and run their own monetary policy, but also allow free trade and capital flows. And under the Bretton Woods system, when it was first created at the end of World War II, most countries had exchange controls. And so it was that third component that was missing. And if you block people from trading their francs for dollars or their marks for dollars, their pounds for dollars, then you can sustain a fixed exchange rate and run your own monetary policy. But of course, you're enormously interrupting international trade when you ration foreign exchange. As the exchange controls began to be lifted in the years after the war, then the internal contradictions became clear, and there were a series of exchange rate crises under Bretton Woods, where countries that had issued more money than was consistent with maintaining the exchange rate to the US dollar, that is, they inflated more than the US dollar, and so the purchasing power of their currency was falling, so that was inconsistent with a fixed exchange rate. Everybody would want to trade for dollars when dollars bought more than domestic currency. They began to run out of dollar reserves, and so they either had to change the exchange rate or they had to tighten monetary policy. The Bretton Woods Agreement created the International Monetary Fund to kind of manage this process of either lending for countries that couldn't maintain their fixed exchange rate to the dollar. It either lent them dollars or it gave them permission to devalue. So there were devaluations by Great Britain and France and other countries. Meanwhile, Germany was inflating less than the US, so Germany actually adjusted its exchange rate in the other direction. It strengthened against the dollar. The dollar's pegged to gold seemed pretty durable, but the US was inflating more than was consistent. So the purchasing power of the dollar was falling relative to the purchasing power of gold. And so foreign central banks that accumulated dollars wanted to trade them for gold. And they started trading them for gold, especially France. The US started running out of gold. And everybody knew under a classical gold standard that if you started losing gold, you had to stop expansionary monetary policy. But the Fed kept it up, and even before Nixon closed the gold window, the Fed was acting inconsistently with its obligation to maintain the peg at $35 an ounce. So at some point in the 1960s, inflation in the US started to go up to a point where it was inconsistent with the fixed exchange rate. The US was losing gold to foreign central banks. And finally, President Johnson, before Nixon, put restrictions on the convertibility of dollars into gold, stopped trying to control the market price of gold in London, the dollar price of gold in London rose to above $40 an ounce. And so there's a clear arbitrage profit for any central bank that can get gold for $35 and then sell it for $40. And so gold was draining out of the US Treasury, and finally, rather than restrict US monetary policy, Nixon closed the gold window. And as I said, economists had seen that coming. And apart from people who appreciated the operation of the classical gold standard and wanted to return to something like it, people like Rueff and Hazlitt, other economists celebrated it. Milton Friedman thought this was great because now the Fed can control the quantity of money in a more rational way, which of course didn't happen. He didn't get the moderate money growth that he was advocating. Instead, money growth became immoderate, and we got double-digit inflation within a decade.
They even predicted that the gold price would collapse after the closing of the gold window, right?
Right. So Friedman said there really isn't much demand in the market for gold. It's just central bank demand that's keeping up the price. So if the Fed stops pegging the dollar to gold, and this was an important part of his assumption, sells its gold on the free market, and other central banks sell their gold, they didn't have as much other than France. If they sell their gold on the market, then the market price of gold will collapse. But of course, two things happened that upset his prediction. One, central banks didn't sell their gold. And two, central banks inflated to the point where the public started wanting gold as an inflation hedge. And so the real price of gold has risen quite a bit since the end of Bretton Woods, contrary to predictions. But the conditions for the predictions weren't met.